Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos que nos acompañan hoy día. Estamos en la quinta sesión de nuestro ciclo Fin de una época, hacia dónde va la política, que organizamos la Fundación Friedrich Ebert, la Escuela de Ciencia Política de la Universidad Diego Portales, el COES y el proyecto de investigación conjunta ANIT Sociedad Max Planck. Muy bienvenidos. Bueno, como les decía, hoy día estamos en la quinta sesión para conversar sobre capitalismo en tiempos de pandemia. Hablar de crisis de capitalismo se ha vuelto algo cada vez más recurrente, ¿no es cierto? Donde las últimas crisis económicas probablemente han sido un acelerador para estas reflexiones. Instalado el coronavirus, observamos una explosión de teorías al respecto, que van desde quienes anuncian el fin del capitalismo hasta quienes aseveran que nada cambiará. Lo cierto es que al menos se están desarrollando tensiones importantes en lo que se ha identificado como la versión neoliberal del capitalismo. Las consecuencias de la crisis climática global, en el cuestionamiento de los modelos de desarrollo, la vuelta a tendencias proteccionistas en algunos países, el fortalecimiento del rol del Estado como respuesta al COVID-19, el reordenamiento de la geopolítica global, con China ganando protagonismo, todo esto parece apuntar a que efectivamente se están produciendo cambios profundos, aun cuando no sabemos todavía hasta dónde llegarán. Bueno, sobre esto y otros temas queremos conversar hoy día con ustedes, con estos tres panelistas muy interesantes que nos acompañan. Está Kenneth Roberts con nosotros, profesor de la Universidad de Cornell, Nicolás Eyzaguirre, economista y ex ministro en varias carteras, muy conocido acá en Chile, Vivien Schmidt también, profesora de la Universidad de Boston. A todos ellos muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy día. También quiero dar las gracias a nuestro moderador, Cristóbal Rovira de la UDP, que nos ha acompañado en todas estas sesiones, desde la concepción de ellas, las preguntas a los panelistas y, por supuesto, en la moderación de cada evento. Les quiero hacer una pequeña introducción a cuál va a ser la metodología hoy día. Vamos a trabajar con 3 bloques, con preguntas para cada panelista, donde ellos tienen 5 minutos para responder cada vez. Si alguno de ustedes como participantes quiere hacer preguntas a nuestros panelistas, por favor escríbenla en el chat de Zoom, desde donde las iremos recogiendo para presentarlas a los panelistas. Además les agrego un dato práctico: como 2 de nuestros panelistas hablan inglés, vamos a tener traducción simultánea, como hemos tenido en otras ocasiones, que está disponible en el botón que aparece en forma de mapamundi en la parte baja de su pantalla a la derecha. Pueden seleccionar ahí una de las 3 opciones. Tenemos inglés, para los que quieran escuchar la sesión completa en ese idioma, español, para los que quieran escuchar la sesión completa en español, o escuchar siempre el idioma original, inglés o español, dependiendo de quién nos hable. Aprovecho entonces también para dar las gracias a nuestros traductores, que ayudan siempre a que estos eventos sean más fáciles para todos. Bueno, con esto solamente dejo a Cristóbal para que siga con la moderación y deseándonos que tengamos un muy buen debate hoy día. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Arlet, por la presentación. Muchas gracias, como siempre, a la Fundación Friedrich Ebert por apoyarnos en la gestión y la organización de estos eventos. Para mí es un agrado hoy día dirigir esta conversación que vamos a tener con 3 connotados invitados, que todos ellos aceptaron participar, así que los voy a presentar brevemente, siguiendo su orden alfabético. Parto entonces por Nicolás Eyzaguirre, que, como ya dijo Arlet, es conocido por la mayoría de las personas en Chile. Él es economista, es ex ministro de Hacienda en 2 oportunidades, tanto en el gobierno de Ricardo Lagos como en el segundo gobierno de Michelle Bachelet, y a su vez fue ex ministro de Educación y de la Secretaría General de la Presidencia en el segundo gobierno de Michelle Bachelet. Él es militante del PPD, también ha sido director del Departamento del Hemisferio Occidental del Fondo Monetario Internacional y presidente del directorio de Canal 13. Así que muchas gracias, Nicolás, por estar conectados con nosotros el día de hoy. En segundo lugar, tenemos a alguien que desde la UDP podría decir que es prácticamente de la casa, porque nos ha visitado un par de veces en Chile. Su nombre es Kenneth Roberts, él es profesor de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Cornell. Él se ha especializado en el estudio de América Latina, con un particular énfasis en economía política, partidos políticos y movimientos sociales. Entre sus distintas obras, yo creo que destaca sobre todo su último libro, que se llama Changing Course in Latin America, Party Systems in Latin America's Neoliberal Era, publicado por Cambridge University Press el año 2014. Así que muchas gracias, Kenneth, por estar hoy día también con nosotros. En tercer lugar tenemos a Vivien Schmidt, quien nos visitó en Chile un par de años atrás. Esta vez nos está visitando de forma virtual, pero no de manera presencial. Ella es profesora de Ciencia Política y de Relaciones Internacionales en la Universidad de Boston. Sus investigaciones se caracterizan, y yo diría que esta es una singularidad de Vivien, por combinar distintas subdisciplinas como la economía política, la política comparada y las relaciones internacionales. Gran parte de su obra se focaliza en el estudio de Europa y este año, podríamos decir en buen chileno, acaba de salir del horno, acaba de publicar un libro con Oxford University Press que se llama Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy. Thank you very much, Vivien, for being with us today. Así es que, después de haber presentado mis tres expositores, como ya dijo Arlette, yo voy a abrir un ciclo de preguntas y vamos a seguir un orden que va a consistir que yo siempre voy a partir por Kenneth Roberts, a quien le voy a preguntar en inglés, después voy a pasar a Nicolás Eyzaguirre en español, y después voy a pasar a Vivien en inglés, y de esta manera ayudamos el trabajo de nuestros traductores simultáneos para estar siempre yendo de un idioma a otro idioma. Así que, sin más que eso, parto entonces y me voy a la primera pregunta para Kenneth Roberts. Kenneth, thank you very much for being with us today, and I will start with you with the first question. And my question to you is the following. A few years ago, you published an article in Nueva Sociedad in which you argue that in Latin America, there are no conditions for the emergence of strong social democratic parties, particularly because of the existence of a neoliberal capitalist systems that generates a very heterogeneous working class and extremely weak labor unions. So my question to you is the following. Seeing the tensions that we observe today in countries like Chile and Brazil, do you see any possibility of the birth of a broad electoral coalition that promotes social democratic policies? Or to put the question in another way, to what extent is an alliance like the one of Podemos and PSOE in Spain possible in the Latin American context?
Okay, well, thank you, Cristobal, and I thank everyone for the opportunity to participate in the session here today. I think the question you've posed is an important one for Latin America. And I have to say, since the time that I wrote the article that you mentioned, that was quite a while ago. And okay, so I was just going to say, I think a lot has happened since I wrote that piece. And what I would argue about the possibilities for social democracy in Latin America today and the kinds of coalitions that you're talking about, I do think there are possibilities. And at least in the abstract sense of some sort of social democratic model that would be clearly committed to liberal representative democracy, and also that would be reformist and redistributive in terms of moving towards a more egalitarian model of economic development. I think that is a possibility for Latin America. And so broadly conceived, I would argue that that is a type of social democracy, but I think it would likely be a different kind of social democracy from what we've seen historically in Europe. And that shouldn't surprise us. Europe itself is finding it difficult to continue with the traditional kinds of social democratic models. And so you see Europe struggling to adapt social democracy to an era of globalization, especially a globalization of financial markets. But I would argue that what you're likely to see in Latin America, what the opportunities would be for progressive alternatives, I think you would see more heterogeneous kinds of coalitions. In other words, a social democracy that is less dependent on labor unions and the organized working class as a core constituency. It's probably going to be a social democracy where the levels of the transfer of income through taxation and transfer policies, it's hard to imagine Latin America getting to the levels of 50 or 60% of taxation that you see in Europe, or 70% of labor unionization as sort of the classic social democratic kinds of models. But I think what you also have in Latin America, although neoliberalism fragments the working class and makes it difficult to have a strong organized labor core for a social democratic movement, neoliberalism also tends to create grievances for a lot of other different kinds of social actors, whether it's pensioners, whether it's students, people working in the healthcare field. And so you can see mobilization and political activity around those grievances for a much more heterogeneous kind of coalition. And I think there are opportunities to try to pull that together, certainly in the electoral arena. I think the left has demonstrated that they can win elections in Latin America. We've had over 30 presidents from the left elected in Latin America since the late 1990s. So it's clearly possible to win elections. I think we've discovered it's somewhat more difficult to actually govern on the left and to implement and sustain the kinds of redistributive reforms. So I would argue that is really the key challenge. It's not so much getting elected for a progressive coalition, but it's bringing about the kinds of institutional reforms, maintaining the kinds of interactive relationships between state reformers and civil society and social movements, but trying to build linkages then between civil society and political parties so that you can advance a reformist agenda. And I think that's where we've found it to be difficult to really sustain that kind of momentum within Latin America. But I don't want to be overly pessimistic. I do think there are opportunities for that kind of agenda within Latin America.
Many thanks, Ken, for your answer to the first question, and I will move now to Spanish to Nicolás Eyzaguirre. Nicolás, para quienes te conocemos acá en Chile, sabemos que tú recientemente has escrito un libro titulado Desigualdad, en donde planteas que nuestro país se ha construido, y aquí cito textualmente, por más de 2 siglos sobre las bases de instituciones oligárquicas que le han impedido un equitativo progreso social, cierre de comillas. A la luz de la crisis económica y política que estamos viviendo hoy en día en Chile, mi pregunta es, ¿cuán factible es romper esta dinámica de desarrollo que tú planteas en el libro? Y pregunto esto también porque está el tema de la automatización del trabajo, el cual es un desafío importante para el futuro de la economía capitalista en Chile.
Gracias, Cristóbal. Aprovecho de saludar a Arlet y a Jorge y a mis colegas Vivien y Kenneth. Para hablar de Chile y Latinoamérica, es preciso comprender que nuestra matriz institucional deriva de la particular forma en que fuimos colonizados. La riqueza fue apropiada por el conquistador a sangre y fuego y repartida, en el caso de Chile, entre los adláteres, tanto de Pedro de Valdivia como de García Hurtado de Mendoza, que era el primer gobernador. Y desde allí ha habido una clase oligárquica endogámica que inicialmente se hizo fuerte como terrateniente en la zona central y que al correr el siglo XIX se autoasignó también el comercio y la banca y el sistema financiero. Con el correr del tiempo y a medida que se fue ampliando el derecho a voto y después del derecho a voto la educación, partidos políticos populares comenzaron a ser cada vez más elegibles y en particular después de la crisis del modelo exportador en el año 29 hubo un surgimiento muy fuerte al alero del Estado de los grupos medios, básicamente de empleados. Lo paradojal de todo esto es que no obstante que se amplió el franchise o el derecho a voto y que por tanto las mayorías no oligárquicas fueron incrementando significativamente su capacidad de atraer votantes, nunca de verdad la oligarquía inicial dejó de tener alguna forma de veto sobre el avance social. Cooptó en medida importante la industrialización, porque ahora los neoliberales le echan la culpa a la izquierda de la industrialización, pero la verdad es que fue promovida básicamente por los capitanes de la industria que venían de la misma oligarquía. Entonces la pregunta es, ¿por qué si la mayoría social, conforme se amplió el derecho a voto, constituye una mayoría, potencialmente una mayoría política, ¿por qué no se ha podido hacer una coalición suficientemente fuerte para poder cambiar este modelo que con cambios más, cambios menos, viene siendo el mismo patrón original de una inserción liberal en el mundo a partir de los recursos naturales que quedaron desde la colonia atrapados en una oligarquía que no es más que el 1% de la población. A eso le sumamos el comercio y la banca y tenemos ahí básicamente lo que es Chile. Quizás más adelante, para no copar y aprovechando que está Kenneth y Vivien, que les interesa el tema de la economía política, a mi modo de ver, Latinoamérica en general y Chile en particular ha sufrido de una contradicción que no ha sabido resolver. De una parte tiene un sistema, y en Chile es muy particular eso, hiperpresidencial, y el presidencialismo tiene los problemas de discrecionalidad, de caudillismo que todos conocemos, pero en una cultura que es mucho más europea en el sentido de que son tradiciones culturales multipartidarias. Y desde muy temprano nosotros tenemos representación de los trabajadores, de los empleados, de los grupos medios, de los grupos más liberales y de los grupos más conservadores. Entonces la combinación del pluripartidismo con el presidencialismo exacerbado es una combinación fatal, porque impide el que se produzca una coalición suficientemente grande de quienes quisieran cambiar el sistema neoliberal en torno a un programa común. Y eso se dijo en la introducción. ¿Por qué en Chile no es posible la alianza que hubo en España entre el PSOE y el Podemos? Y la razón es que básicamente el sistema es un sistema perverso que induce la competencia al interior de los que quieren el cambio y facilita a la oligarquía mantener el poder, más los poderes adicionales que se granjearon con la constitución de Pinochet, que hace que la alianza en contra de la oligarquía tenga que ser realmente muy masiva para lograr cambiar las cosas. Ahí me quedo.
Muchas gracias, Nicolás. And I switch now to English and to Italy, because Vivien was telling us that she's in Italy at the moment. So thank you very much, Vivien, for joining us, because it's later in Italy than in the US and in Chile. So, Vivien, my question for you is the following. In your book, Resilient Liberalism in Europe's Political Economy, you argue that the global expansion of neoliberalism is one of the main causes of the so-called Great Recession of the years 2008 and 2009. Nevertheless, the neoliberal model was not seriously affected by this economic crisis, and this is one of the paradoxes that you analyze in your book. Take, for instance, the austerity policies that were implemented in Southern Europe right after the crisis. So my question for you is the following. Can we think that now the situation is different as a result of the economic crisis related to the pandemic? And I'm asking you this because the vast majority of countries seem to be willing to move away from neoliberal orthodoxy, and even the European Union now has approved a novel package of economic stimulus.
So thank you for inviting me. Delighted to be with you all. Excellent question, and it's relevant for Chile and Latin America more generally, as much for Europe on the nature of neoliberalism. So I'm going to begin with that and then discuss the European case. So in my book on resilient liberalism with Mark Thatcher, we identified 5 lines of analysis for why neoliberalism has remained resilient. So number 1 is the adaptability or the mutability of the core ideas. Market solutions always better, state problematic, even as the state is used to free up markets, to enhance markets. That's number 1. Number 2 is rhetoric versus reality. Neoliberals talk a good game, but often they don't deliver or can't deliver it, because if they do what they promise to do, they would not be reelected. But great excuse then to come back within a generation and say, no, it was never done. Number 3 is, in many cases, maybe the neoliberals are better in debates. And part of that is that a lot of what they say seems common sense. I think about Chancellor Merkel's use of the Schwabian housewife metaphor, who knows how to tighten her belt, just like government should, which of course defies the neo-Keynesian truths that you can't do that. But by the time I explain you neo-Keynesianism, I'm in a minute and a half or more, whereas the Schwabian housewife is a 30-second soundbite. So maybe that neoliberalism is better in debate, or maybe we're really talking about the weakness of the opposition in debate. After all, where have the Social Democrats been through much of this? So number 4 is that neoliberalism also serves the interests of the most powerful, whether we're talking about cutting taxes or deregulation of businesses. And the most wealthy, the bankers, are laughing all the way to the bank. And then number 5 is that once neoliberalism really gets in, it becomes institutionalized and it's embedded in the rules, and it's very hard to stop. And that's really what we saw in Europe. So if we think about the financial crisis, despite the massive failure of neoliberalism as exemplified by the financial market crash, and before that, the dot-com boom and bust, and many other such crises, what we saw in this 2008-2009 period is, after a brief hiatus of 9 months of neo-Keynesian policy, we go straight back to the resilience of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism comes back with a vengeance, especially ordoliberalism, the German version. So it's neoliberalism with rules. This is Jean-Claude Trichet in the European Central Bank. This is the German Minister of Finance in particular, and it's deficit and debt bad, Schuld, sin. The US, interestingly enough, takes a less orthodox route, and it ends up doing much better later in the following years than the EU, and especially, of course, once Europe ends up in the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. Once that hits, we see the same resilience of neoliberalism. And part of this is it seems so much easier simply to reinforce the existing rules, especially when member states don't agree. So in my current book on the Eurozone crisis and its crisis of legitimacy, what we see is not just the resilience of neoliberalism, but a crisis of legitimacy in terms of performance, in terms of political legitimacy and procedures. So initially what we see is the EU leaders assume all you need to do is double down on the neoliberal, ordoliberal rules with austerity, i.e. tighten belts, and structural reforms, crush unions, cut the welfare state, especially in program countries. And the assumption is you do all of that and you'll get good conformance, so no need to deal with the people and ask them. But what you see is within a very short period, a couple of years, economic performance deteriorates, there's a double dip recession, and the politics gets increasingly toxic. We see massive protests in the streets and the rise of populist challengers on the right and the left. And so by 2012, you begin to see a reinterpretation of the rules, increasing flexibility, abandonment of austerity by 2013, and the structural reforms become less and less rigid, more and more social. But this is done by stealth, not admitting it. There are further legitimacy problems here. And it's really only in 2015 that EU actors essentially admit their flexibility, but the damage has been done. We see increasingly bad public perceptions, the continued rise of the populist revolt, and the continued decline of mainstream parties. So by 2020, everything seems just about back in shape. Growth is back. Politics seems better. And then the pandemic hits. So there, it's really interesting. This time really is different, to answer Cristobal's final question here. The EU actors seem to have learned the lessons of the Eurozone crisis. In the very first stage, though, it looked like resilience of neoliberalism. It looked like the Eurozone crisis, déjà vu all over again. There were the European Council of Member State leaders failed to act. As member states pursued their own policies, the European Central Bank claimed, oh, it's not our mandate to deal with the spreads between Germany and Italy, and then Italian bond interest rates on bonds go massively skyrocketing, and the Commission is nowhere. And it looks also like the migration crisis again, as national level borders go up. But this is this is the immediate response. Very quickly, everything changes. The member states throw out Euro crisis, budgetary austerity with massive infusions. National states take back control. They even engage in nationalization. The European Central Bank, after its initial misstep, becomes the hero as it pushes, as it does a big pandemic emergency rescue. The Council, the European Council, is no longer a kind of dictatorship led by Germany as it seemed in the crisis, but now Germany is in the lead with France to push for EU level funds. In short, the EU seems to have learned the lessons of the legitimacy lessons of the Eurozone crisis, except for a few member states, the so-called frugal four. But just to end, there's still potential problems. The governing by rules and ruling by numbers of the Eurozone have only been suspended. They're not officially revoked. The Eurozone still lacks many of the necessary instruments to ensure its optimal performance, and the populist result that stems in part from citizen reactions to the Eurozone crisis is not over. And so much depends upon what happens with the economy as we go forward in the next couple of years.
Many thanks, Vivien. And now I move from Europe to Latin America back and to Ken Roberts then. So Ken, my question to you is the following. So with the appearance of figures like Macri in Argentina, Piñera in Chile, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, some analysts and many scholars have argued that Latin America has experienced the resurgence of the right, and of course the end of the resurgence of the left that we have seen in the previous decade. However, empirical evidence does not exactly indicate that citizens in Latin America are in favor of neoliberal economics. How then, and this is my question, can we explain this reappearance of right-wing forces in Latin America? Is this a temporary phenomenon related to the fall in the price of commodities, for example? Or do you think that this is related to a structural change in the electorate of Latin American societies?
Okay, well, I think it's a good question, and it's a complicated question. But it's one that I think the simple answer I would give to it is that it is certainly true that electorally there has been a shift to the right in Latin America over the last 6 or 7 years now. So there has been a political shift, but I would argue that it is basically what I would call a routine alternation in office. In other words, I don't see it as a shift that is indicating an ideological shift to the right or a sharp a certain set of policies or a programmatic shift to the right. Instead, what I think it is basically a routine alternation in office where you had had in most of the region governments of the left, in many cases governments that had been in power for a number of consecutive terms. So you had 3 or 4 different terms in office. And I think there's a natural attrition process when the same party or movement has been in power for multiple terms in office. Inevitably, people begin to want to change, and it's very easy to whatever minor grievances may exist. It's easy to sort of bundle those together into a call for some sort of political change. And so I think it's difficult to reproduce any particular party or movement in office indefinitely. And certainly in the Latin American case, I would argue that the political shift to the left that began really in the late 1990s and then went into the first decade of the 2000s, that I would argue actually was a genuine political shift that was programmatically driven. In other words, I disagree with a lot of my colleagues who say that that was also a routine alternation in office. I don't think that was the case. I think that after 2 decades in Latin America of the debt crisis in the 80s and then the neoliberal reforms, I think Latin American citizens were asking for a model of economic development where the state was more active, where the state was able to play a role in bringing different groups into the political arena and incorporating them into the social welfare benefits, and trying in particular to incorporate people who were not included in the old segmented welfare states of the import substitution industrialization era. So an effort to try to incorporate informal sector workers, the rural poor, women who had been in and out of the workforce over the years. And so I think that there was a real effort in Latin America to try to have a more inclusive model of economic development in that particular era. The commodity boom, I don't think, was the cause of the left turn. I think the commodity boom undoubtedly extended the left turn because it allowed governments of the left to try to address some of these social problems while also maintaining relatively stable macroeconomic conditions until you get to 2013, 2014. When the commodity boom comes to an end, clearly that puts the governments of the left on the defensive. And so part of what took place then, part of the new turning point in 2013, 2014, 2015 was the end of the commodity boom. And that is coming at a time period where you have had governments of the left for quite some period of time in a number of Latin American countries. And so I think the political attrition process and the demand for change helps to account for the fact that you get a number of electoral defeats. Prior to that point, the number of consecutive re-elections was actually quite extraordinary of the leftist governments within Latin America. In a region where anti-incumbent voting has been the norm, we did not see anti-incumbent voting against the governments of the left until you get to 2013, 2014, 2015. So ultimately then, clearly the end of the commodity boom has had its effect on the governments of the left. It has helped to usher into power, had this new alternation of office where you get governments of the right coming in. But I don't see, in the public opinion polls and other evidence that I look at, I don't see strong indication that the citizens of Latin America are wanting to turn back to neoliberalism, or that there's really a strong electoral base for that. I think what you see is that the parties of the right really have a problem. I don't think their economic agenda, I don't think a neoliberal agenda is really a winning electoral platform in Latin America. Most Latin American citizens, from what I see in the surveys, indicate they want to see governments play a role in extending social welfare measures, education, healthcare, pension plans, etc. And so I think especially a pure neoliberal model where you actually have not only the privatization of industries and liberalization of prices, but you actually have a privatization of Social Security and education and healthcare. I don't see an electoral base for that in Latin America. So I think it means that for the right-wing parties to be successful, they're very dependent on what political scientists call valence issues, meaning things like we support economic modernization or growth, or we're opposed to corruption, or crime is the other big one. In fact, the big calling card, I think, for the right in Latin America, it's not so much the economic platform, but it's crime and domestic security kinds of issues. So I think what you see is that parties of the right, certainly in the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil, he played very heavily on the law and order kind of platform. So I think what you see is kind of what you might call a law and order populism. Parties of the right trying to appeal, whether it's in terms of crime and security, sort of being tough against the bad guys and maintaining order, or whether it's appealing to conservative Christian morality or traditional morality. But you see other kinds of social and cultural issues that the parties of the right are having to appeal to. And you see the same thing in the United States and Europe as well, is that what we call the far right is not necessarily a far right on the economic platform. In fact, they're often not right-wing at all on the economic platform. And so what I would argue that there are really different axes or dimensions of electoral competition. And what we're calling the right, I think you often see competing for support on social and cultural issues that are really orthogonal to the classic left-right economic axis. And I think that it really becomes a question of political packaging, or it's a political construct, whether or not those things get lumped together with neoliberal economics. So that's, I think, the bottom line that I see. I don't see this being an ideological or a programmatic shift towards a neoliberal model of development, which I think continues to have a difficult time in the electoral arena.
Excellent. Many thanks, Ken. And I move now to Santiago de Chile with Nicolás. Y la pregunta que me gustaría hacerte es la siguiente. Si es que nosotros observamos el escenario actual, sabemos que tanto el estallido social como la pandemia han puesto en evidencia los límites del modelo de desarrollo chileno, así como también la creciente demanda, diría yo, y esto conecta con lo que decía Kenneth Roberts, por la implementación de reformas en dirección hacia un modelo socialdemócrata. No obstante, también sabemos que la construcción de este modelo requiere de gran cantidad de recursos y de un Estado robusto. Por lo tanto, desde tu experiencia como economista y como ministro, ¿crees tú que Chile tiene las condiciones económicas para moverse hacia esta dirección? O dicho de otra manera, ¿es factible construir un estado de bienestar en nuestro país?
Yo cada vez más he derivado hacia tratar de entender el decurso de nuestra estrategia de desarrollo como un fenómeno de economía política y no como un fenómeno de políticas públicas. Porque las políticas públicas las podemos discutir hasta la infinidad, pero no es nada claro que el sistema político vaya a tomar las buenas y desechar las malas, porque eso depende de la distribución del poder. Entonces, tomando un poco lo que decía Kenneth, a través de la historia de América Latina, la oligarquía siempre ha logrado obstaculizar un modelo más inclusivo, y su expresión más clara es su capacidad de resistir el incremento de la carga tributaria. Piensen ustedes que Chile, que es posiblemente el país más avanzado en esto, tiene una carga tributaria directa a las personas, esa parte que es progresiva de los impuestos, de 1,5 puntos del PIB, mientras los países desarrollados tienen una carga promedio de 10 puntos del PIB. Entonces, y lo tienen desde los años 70. Si uno hiciera solo ingeniería social, diría, bueno, si yo logro subir los impuestos a 6, 7 puntos de carga tributaria directa, yo puedo construir un estado de bienestar. O sea, no hay un problema de restricción económica. El problema es político. Y tiene que ver con la capacidad de coalicionarse entre los del centro y los de la izquierda, porque en esto hay toda una cierta ironía. Cuando Vivien hablaba de los problemas del estado de bienestar en Europa, uno conoce que, dadas las cargas tributarias que ellos tienen, convencer a la población que es necesario más bienes públicos, aunque signifique menos bienes privados, se hace más cuesta arriba. No obstante que es necesario, ya vemos que el modelo nórdico es un modelo con una carga tributaria mucho más alta y con mucho más dinamismo productivo y social. Pero uno entiende que hay una cierta fatiga tributaria. Pero cuando tú tienes las cargas tributarias ridículas que tienes en Latinoamérica, el win-win posible de una mayor carga tributaria y un bienestar mayor para la inmensa mayoría de la población, ya sea en salud, en educación, en pensiones, en infraestructura, en acceso al crédito, es enorme. Entonces uno se pregunta, ¿cómo no se produce esa coalición natural por lograr elevar la carga tributaria, que los que más tienen paguen un poco más, y por tanto expandir el estado de bienestar? Entonces, para eso hay que entender bien cómo está engranado en el sistema político la capacidad de veto de la minoría oligárquica. Y por eso mi gran esperanza en el caso de Chile, que puede ser una luz para el resto, es que a través del plebiscito y la convención constituyente, nosotros hagamos algunos cambios, no son muchos los que se requieren, que permitan efectivamente que esta mayoría pueda coalicionar y cambiar el contrato social, que podemos hacerlo, porque te insisto, como ex ministro de Hacienda, sé que no significa la bancarrota, ni el término de la propiedad privada, ni la expropiación de nada. Simplemente si los recursos naturales pagaran los impuestos que tienen que pagar y quienes más tienen pagaran los impuestos que tienen que pagar, tú podrías tener un sistema mucho más inclusivo. Ahora, solamente para redondear, la capacidad que ha tenido históricamente la derecha de poner un dique y evitar esta coalición grande hacia su izquierda que cambie el estado de cosas, hace que se produzca una impaciencia cada vez más grande. Y esa impaciencia hace que se produzcan divisiones al interior de lo que podría ser una coalición por el cambio entre los sectores más de centro y los sectores más de izquierda que quieren ciertos cambios radicales ahora y ya. Entonces hay que pensar muy bien la ingeniería política para evitar que eso se produzca, porque la acumulación de presión no siempre es la mejor consejera de una estrategia mayoritaria. De hecho, yo siento que hoy en Chile tenemos una insuficiente discusión sobre el tema del crecimiento, porque aquí no se trata solo de cobrar más para distribuir más, se trata de cambiar el modelo de desarrollo, y el modelo de desarrollo supone inversiones cuantiosas en elementos que son pro desarrollo, como la educación, la ciencia, la tecnología y la infraestructura, que no son elementos de los cuales la gente vaya a obtener beneficios inmediatos. Entonces ahí el ser capaces de tener un modelo consensual al interior, ¿cierto?, de la centro-izquierda, de cuánto podemos esperar con legitimidad para satisfacer necesidades básicas, y cuánto tenemos que invertir en la gente y en la ciencia y la tecnología para poder cambiar nuestra matriz productiva, no es una articulación tan simple de hacer. Y las voces populistas que dicen, bueno, cobrémosle un súper impuesto a los súper ricos y somos todos felices, no ayudan mucho, porque esto es un fenómeno complejo. Eso.
Muchas gracias, Nicolás. Volveremos sobre el tema seguro un poquito más adelante cuando recojamos las preguntas del público. Now I switch again in English to Vivien. And Vivien, I would like to ask you something about your new book. You already mentioned something about it, but people that are hearing us probably don't know, or maybe they do know, that you have recently published the book Europe Crisis of Legitimacy, in which my feeling is that you're critical of the role that technocrats have often played in the development of the European project. For example, and something that you already mentioned in your previous intervention, the role of the European Central Bank in the Great Recession. So my question to you is, what are the reasons why technocrats jeopardize democratic legitimacy? And what solutions do you propose to deal with this problem of the growing power of technocratic institutions?
Okay, thank you. Yes, this actually links us back to my discussion of neoliberal ideas earlier. And it's essentially about technocrats reducing the power of the people and essentially ending up with an often anti-democratic push. I mean, you look at the neoliberal theorists, economic philosophers, and some actually really do want to take this out of the hands of the people and essentially put governance into the hands of technocrats, because there's an assumption that technocratic rule always produces the best results. This is about the regulatory state, which is seen as more impartial and rules-based, with experts, mainly economists, who essentially took over from the lawyers and political scientists of Keynesian times, to produce a more technocratic governance that was also much more difficult to understand by the people, if you will, with its own language, etc. So there are two main problems with the assumptions of sort of neoliberal technocracy. I think we should call it that. It produces the best results, which, as we've seen, is not the case. And the second is that it works in a democracy, in democracies, and it works for democracies. And what we've seen over time is that people have become increasingly alienated and disaffected because they see governments, their own, and here we can talk about Latin America as well as Europe, and also the European Union, if we're talking about Europe, as not sufficiently politically responsive. Increasingly, governments of the center right and the center left did exactly the same thing. It's Tweedledum, Tweedledee. So it actually makes perfect sense, as we heard from Kenneth earlier, it makes perfect sense that there's a move toward the extremes on the right and on the left, to populist extremes with easier answers, with a rejection of experts. In particular, when we see that they actually didn't do the right thing. They didn't produce the results that kept being promised. I, of course, also see this as a problem of legitimacy and democracy, especially in Europe, at the European Union level, where technocratic rules even further removed policymakers from the kind of democratic checks and balances and control that you are more likely to have at the national level. But more generally, technocratic depoliticizes decision-making. It takes it out of the hands of political leaders who are politically accountable to the citizens, and puts decisions in the hands of independent technical officials or technocrats who are often given autonomous authority to decide. Now, part of the reason for that, of course, is that there's a neoliberal assumption that all politicians are self-interested rent seekers, and that's right, but will do so impartially. Obviously, I don't like to knock experts entirely, because we are all experts here. But I mean, what the failure is to see that the move toward technocracy reduces democratic control over policy. And there's an assumption that policy is neutral, but of course it's not, as Nicolás was clearly telling us earlier. But I mean, what's interesting about all of this, that neoliberalism, in some ways we're all neoliberals now. Neoliberalism has become so accepted as a background philosophy that there's an assumption that there's only one way to do things. It's kind of TINA. There is no alternative in Margaret Thatcher's terms. So now to move toward the Eurozone crisis, what happens in the Eurozone crisis? And here, Cristobal, I would like to blame politicians as well as technocrats, because in a way it's the politicians who chose a kind of technocratic solution and an attempt to depoliticize decision-making in the Eurozone crisis. Oh no, we're not making the decision, it's the experts who are deciding, it's the technocrats. But in fact, it is the politicians. So I think there's shared blame here. And in the European Council, made up of member state leaders, using intergovernmental rule, it's the creditors in terms of member states, it's Northern Europeans, Germany, the Netherlands, the Finland, etc., and had outside power to impose their preferences and dictate the terms of the rescue. And these were about neo and ordo-liberal preferences. And so the creditors essentially punished the debtors in Southern Europe. As I said earlier, you know, debt is a sin and therefore, etc. And so one could argue here, and I do it in my book, I try to ask about legitimacy, Janist-faced, and in terms of the Eurozone crisis for the Council, was it a dictatorship led by Germany or a mutually accountable deliberative body? In the first couple of years, you could say it was a kind of dictatorship, imposing austerity and structural reform on everyone, but in particular on Southern Europe, in particular program countries. However, over time, you see it becomes increasingly mutual accountable as a deliberative body, as growth comes into the conversation, then flexibility, and then by 2015, investment. But in this first moment, what you see is an attempt to depoliticize the crisis by giving over responsibility for implementation to technocrats. But what you see by 2012 is they actually slowly become ministers of moderation. So here, sort of the technocrats really start out perhaps as the bad guys, but increasingly they become the good guys as they resist pressure from the creditors to keep punishing the debtors, recognizing that there are bad outcomes, generally speaking, and the rise of populism is a threat to the European Union more generally. We can also talk about the European Central Bank in similar fashion. It starts out, well, here actually, you know, here you've got to ask, was it the hero of the crisis? After all, it did save the euro. But it took a long time. And you could argue just as easily it was the ogre of the crisis because it pushed austerity and structural reform and pushed countries into programs initially. And it appeared totally unaccountable in terms of demanding austerity and structural reform. So, you know, what do we do? Where do we go from here? And here I think what one needs to do, in particular in terms of the Eurozone, but one could talk more generally about the EU, one needs to democratize the Eurozone policy. So how do you do that? So lots of the policies, lots of what's called the European semester, which is all of the oversight policies, look very top down, even if there's a lot more bottom up. And what they need to do is they need to make them truly bottom up and truly flexible and give back responsibility for economic policy to the national level. Of course, I write this and I was saying this prior to the pandemic. And what's really interesting and quite wonderful and surprising is that this is exactly what's happened. Member states have taken back control. There's a recognition that you need bottom-up decision-making. What works for one country doesn't necessarily work for the other. We're talking about many different varieties of capitalism with very different kinds of growth models from north to south, and amongst even different kinds of Southern European countries. Each needs its own kind of policies, and for the monetary policy itself also needs to become much more open and debated. And I think that's actually what we're beginning to see. Essentially, I said in the book that by making the decision-making much more bottom-up and giving back control to the national level, it will help counter the populist drift. We'll see what happens, as a result of the pandemic. But I think all of this is really good news.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vivien. And now I start the third and last round of questions that we have, and I move now to Ken Roberts again and to Latin America. So Ken, in a recent article published by Project Syndicate, written by Mariana Mazzucato, she indicates that capitalism faces today a triple crisis: a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a climate crisis. And therefore, according to her arguments, the forces of the left have a unique opportunity to show the shortcomings of the current economic systems and fight for its transformation. Given this diagnosis, I would like to ask you, how well prepared is the left to face this challenge? For example, to what extent can Joe Biden's potential victory in November, I say potential, it's not true, but potential victory, could be a good indicator for this situation or this scenario? And I'm asking you this because the various forces within the Democratic Party in the United States are pressing to implement sort of structural reforms to the existing capitalist system in the United States.
Okay, well, it's another very challenging question. And I think the short answer is yes, I think this is an opportunity for the left, the conjuncture of these different crises that you mentioned. And I think it's an opportunity for the left in part because all three of those crises, they have two effects, I would argue, or two consequences. One is that they tend to concentrate the worst effects, the worst burdens on the poor. And then secondly, to resolve those crises, it's very, very difficult to have good market solutions for those crises. I think they're all crises that require some sort of vigorous state response. And so anytime you're talking about the need for state reaction, and you're talking about crises that are imposing new burdens on the poor, I think you see potential opportunities for the left in this scenario. But I would also think it's important for us to keep in mind crises are very unpredictable, and crises generate very unpredictable kinds of political consequences. And just to come back to something that Vivien very perceptively mentioned before, who would have ever thought that in 2008, 2009, with the onset of the Great Recessions, where you've got an economic crisis that was clearly triggered by the liberalization of financial markets. How then is more liberalization, how is neoliberalism a solution to a crisis that is brought on by the liberalization of financial markets? And yet that's ultimately certainly where Europe goes, and for the most part, the United States as well, backed away from some sort of Keynesian response to it. And so I think you can get very, very odd things coming out in crisis situations. I'm always sort of drawn back to 2008, 2009. I would argue that quite literally Wall Street self-destructed in September of 2008. And Washington had to bail out Wall Street. And then the United States ends up with a populist backlash against Washington. the Tea Party movement is essentially a populist backlash against Washington. And so even though it was Washington that sort of bailed out Wall Street, which was the source of the financial crisis. So those are just some of the unforeseeable kinds of political responses that you could get. But in terms of the current conjuncture, and you brought up Joe Biden in the United States and the Democratic Party. And without question, there has been a shift in the center of gravity within the Democratic Party in the United States. The center of gravity of the party has moved to the left. The Democratic Party has never really been a party of the left in broader comparative international terms. It's basically a centrist liberal political party in comparative terms, but there is now a genuine left within the Democratic Party that has come in part through Bernie Sanders. In some ways, I would argue the Occupy Wall Street movement gets sort of channeled into the Bernie Sanders energy and eventually works its way into the left flank of the Democratic Party. And where most of the energy is today within the Democratic Party, it's around that left flank, and especially the grassroots energy. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, some of the other new leaders that have emerged, there's something new that is going on within the Democratic Party. Now, Joe Biden is not part of that, right? Joe Biden clearly represents the party mainstream. It's much more, it's the centrist, old guard Democratic Party that has been there. It's the Clinton era party. It's the Obama network. That's what Joe Biden represents. But Biden himself is not really a policy wonk. He's not somebody who I think is very deeply grounded in very strong policy commitments, left or right or anything else. I think he's basically somebody who moves and tries to build a consensus, and his strong point is his ability to relate to people. He's not somebody that you look to for policy or programmatic leadership. And so I think what we're likely to see is a Joe Biden platform that is more progressive than what we have seen in the past coming out of the Democratic Party. It's not going to be the platform that we would see had Bernie Sanders won the nomination. Clearly, I mean, this is not going to be Bernie Sanders calling the shot, but you're going to see a platform that I think is some sort of compromise between the Clintonite centrist old guard of the party and this new grassroots energy on the left of the party. And that's a new phenomenon in the United States. It'll be a more progressive platform than what we've seen in the past. At this point, clearly the polls indicate Biden is leading and could easily win this. That's assuming that elections take place as scheduled in the United States and that the various scenarios under which things could go wrong don't happen. So I won't wade into the debates around that. I don't think it's that we can take for granted that we're going to have a clean electoral process and that Donald Trump will accept the results and leave office gracefully were he to lose the election. So I think there are a lot of questions about that. But I think we're in a very uncertain terrain in the United States today, in part because as the Democratic Party does move to more genuinely progressive kinds of positions, it's that for somebody like myself who thinks that's a good thing, it's very attractive. But on the other hand, recognizably, it's polarizing politically. And the United States is a country that is already very deeply polarized politically. Now, for the most part, that polarization in years past has been driven by the Republican Party moving further and further to the right on both the economic axis and on the sociocultural axis of contestation. The Democrats in some ways were very centrist on the economic axis, so they were not really causing polarization, but the Republican Party kept moving further and further towards market fundamentalist positions. But as the Democratic Party begins to move to the left, it does increase the space between the political parties and it feeds into the polarization. And I think polarization, it reinforces the uncertainty as to what could take place in the United States. So bottom line, is this an opportunity for the left? Yes, I think it is. And we are seeing something novel in the United States. What the consequences will be, I think, are still very uncertain and very unpredictable. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yes, many thanks, Ken. And I move now to Nicolás again. Nicolás, me gustaría ahora hacerte una pregunta enfocada nuevamente al caso de Chile. Y nosotros sabemos que en el caso de nuestro país, la matriz productiva, y tú ya lo mencionabas anteriormente, ¿no?, sigue siendo muy centrada en la extracción de materias primas, y la problemática ecológica está mostrando cuáles son los límites de ese modelo de desarrollo extractivista. Por lo tanto, lo que me gustaría preguntarte, en tu experiencia nuevamente como economista y como ministro, es, a tu juicio, ¿qué medidas se pueden implementar para avanzar hacia un modelo de desarrollo de otro tipo? O, preguntado de otra manera, quizás llegó la hora de hacer crecer la caja de herramientas que usan los economistas para pensar las políticas públicas que necesita Chile para poder insertarse de manera exitosa en el capitalismo del siglo XXI.
Para que esto no sea una conversación completamente en paralelo, déjame decir un par de cosas sobre los remarks de Vivien y Kenneth. Yo, Vivien, como tú finalmente lo concluiste, y no por autodefensa, creo que echarle la culpa a los tecnócratas es una forma de evadir a los verdaderos responsables. La derecha tiende a vestirse de culta sobre la base de poner argumentos técnicos por delante. Y hay muchos técnicos que están muy dispuestos a ser capturados por esa oligarquía, porque son quienes finalmente los van a emplear. Cuando ya no estén en el sector público, estarán en el sector privado, en Wall Street o en los bancos. Y tú veías en Estados Unidos como incluso y los conocí a todos ellos, en las épocas demócratas, los que estaban en el Tesoro, se paseaban entre el Tesoro y Wall Street con una facilidad única. Entonces, la capacidad de la derecha, de los grupos más fuertes, de capturar a tecnócratas y vestirse con el ropaje de técnicos es enorme. Pero los técnicos solo pueden discutir qué instrumento es mejor que otro para llegar a un determinado fin, pero no pueden poner los fines. Los fines es un problema político y social. Si la sociedad quiere tener una sociedad más de bienestar y más social y menos privada, o al revés, es una definición política, social, no es una definición que le corresponda a los técnicos. Los técnicos dirán cuáles son los mejores instrumentos para lograrlo. Entonces, el disfrazar opciones políticas de opciones técnicas es una cosa que, por lo menos en esta parte del mundo y también allá, la derecha sabe hacer con gran eficacia. Y siempre hay algunos colegas, desgraciadamente, dispuestos a arrendarse, esto es un poquito fuerte, a los intereses de la derecha y darle un velo técnico-científico a las propuestas de la derecha. Debo decir que yo tengo una fuerte formación neoclásica, y una de las cosas que la gente confunde es la parte más científica de la economía, lo neoclásico, la oferta, la demanda, los monopolios, los oligopolios, con el neoliberalismo. El neoliberalismo es una ideología, no tiene nada que ver con la ciencia económica en aquella parte neoclásica, que no es la única. Entonces aquí hay un disfraz monumental. Los tecnócratas no deberían ser más que lo que son. Bueno, déjame tratar de pensar un poco en el problema de Estados Unidos. ¿Te has fijado tú, Kenneth, que hoy día el mercado que lo está haciendo mejor es el Nasdaq? El Nasdaq está en su peak histórico y bastante alto. ¿Eso qué está reflejando? La anticipación del mercado de que la tecnología, las empresas altamente tecnológicas, van a apropiar una parte más importante del producto en el futuro que ahora, producto precisamente de la pandemia. Y tú sabes que se ha concentrado la riqueza hacia los sectores que justamente son muy intensivos en tecnología, en comunicaciones, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, yo creo que Latinoamérica o Chile, Europa y Estados Unidos constituyen como tres referentes que son distintos. Si uno mira qué es lo que era Europa en el año 75-80, que es cuando tenían el nivel de ingreso per cápita que tiene Chile hoy, el avance del estado de bienestar, la inclusión, la educación universal, etcétera, etcétera, era más avanzado que lo que tenía Estados Unidos a ese mismo nivel de ingreso per cápita. Todavía les pena el sur a Estados Unidos, como diría Acemoglu y Robinson. Pero sin duda que lo inclusivo de la sociedad de Estados Unidos era mucho más grande que nosotros, que somos como la caricatura del Estado oligárquico, donde la salud, la educación, la ciencia y la tecnología son muy malas para la mayoría, virtualmente inexistentes, muy por debajo incluso de lo que hacía Estados Unidos para ese entonces. Ahora el problema es que, y yo sigo muy de cerca la política de Estados Unidos y me alegra mucho oír tus comentarios, Kenneth, es que producto de que la pandemia va a hacer que la capacidad tecnológica sea todavía un bien más escaso, Estados Unidos se va a ver en la disyuntiva de si ceder al modelo más oligárquico, concentrador, neoliberal, que va a terminar siendo un desastre. Porque la ciencia, lo que hizo Estados Unidos lo que es, fue lo inclusivo, la capacidad de que todo el mundo participara en la ganancia de productividad, en la innovación tecnológica. Bueno, tú has visto como Sokolov y otros han publicado mucho. Entonces, la tendencia a la concentración que tiene la actividad tecnológica requiere un contraesfuerzo por parte del Estado en materia de inclusión en tecnología, capacitación, educación, gigantesco. ¿Sí? Es de esperar que esa nueva izquierda que está dentro del Partido Demócrata, que lo han planteado, sean los que finalmente cambien un poco más, ¿cierto?, lo que pasa en Estados Unidos hacia ese objetivo. Nosotros tenemos todo por ganar. Y Kenneth, el tema del commodity boom no fue poco importante en el ascenso a la izquierda, porque como te decía, la derecha, la oligarquía, ha tenido a través de la historia en toda Latinoamérica la capacidad de vetar un pacto tributario consistente con un estado de bienestar. Y por eso seguimos con unas cargas tributarias miserables. Entonces, cuando vino el commodity boom, por una vez los gobiernos se encontraron con dinero para gastar, porque como no podían recaudar impuestos, no podían, ¿cierto?, satisfacer el estado de bienestar y por tanto finalmente o se sobreendeudaban y caían, digamos, en manos del Fondo Monetario Internacional, o no podían satisfacer las demandas sociales y caían frente a una derecha que hacía promesas falsas. El commodity boom nos dio como una especie de relajo de la oportunidad de profundizar el estado de bienestar sin sin derrotar el veto tributario de la derecha. Pero cuando terminó el boom tributario, nos encontramos desnudos, que si no cambiábamos el contrato social, ergo, el contrato tributario, no íbamos a poder simplemente funcionar. Y eso es lo que ha pasado. Chile tiene la posibilidad maravillosa con la nueva constitución de cambiar ciertas, no demasiadas, elementos centrales que permitan construir un Estado social de derecho, donde efectivamente los derechos sociales, pero también el rol del Estado en materia de educación, ciencia y tecnología, nos pongan en una perspectiva de alza. Y aquí esto, Cristóbal, no es ciencia atómica. Si basta ver lo que hicieron los escandinavos o los neozelandeses o los australianos, si el tipo de cosas que tenemos que hacer son relativamente claras. El problema es tener el consenso político y lograr desmontar las ataduras constitucionales para que eso, en definitiva, pueda encarnarse. Y si no lo hacemos, este país va a seguir dando vuelta en redondo con un enfrentamiento y una polarización que yo no quisiera presenciar. Eso, gracias.
Muchas gracias, Nicolás. And now I turn to Vivien to the third question before I open up and collect a couple of questions that have been already raised. And my question to Vivien is again related to Europe. And Vivien, in Europe, we have seen how green parties have been gaining ground, while social democratic parties have increasing problems to maintain good electoral results. So to what extent do you think that the impact of the pandemic will reinforce this trend? And I'm asking you, Dee, because there is a debate about the need to use the package of economic stimulus to advance a green agenda, and the new presidency of the European Commission, I'm thinking about Ursula von der Leyen, she seems to be particularly interested in ecological issues. So do you think that this is a trend that has come to stay?
So yeah, thanks for that question. I'm going to answer it specifically, then I want to move on to add to the more general thoughts of Nicolás and Kenneth, which will also be a larger kind of response. So in terms of the green agenda, it's clear that the EU is moving toward a green agenda generally. The Commission, as you said, is very strongly pushing this, and also major member states, Germany and France in particular, but also some of the Scandinavian countries, even though Central and Eastern European countries are really blocking some of this. The question really is for the EU is how green is the ambition? And of course, in this, the green parties are very important. The question and the problem really is whether green parties are strong enough on their own. They're actually going to need the Social Democrats as coalition partners in most continental European countries. And they're also, in some cases, will want conservative parties as partners, as we've seen also the move in Germany. So the general problem for the center left, it goes back to the 1990s. It lost support from its own natural constituencies by supporting neoliberalism, even if it was neoliberalism with your human face. We're talking mid-1990s and in the early 2000s. And then, of course, in terms of the Eurozone crisis, it went along with austerity and structural reform. So what we see is the mainstream parties in Europe on the left have been in major decline. And even if they're in power, they're very weak. Think about Zapatero in Spain, or in Italy, the PD, the Partito Democratico, with the five-star populist party. And what we see is the mainstream center-right parties have fared better, but they've also lost a lot to the populist extremes. So this is a big question about what's moving forward. Of course, this is Cristobal's area in terms of national populism, which is really, I think, the biggest danger moving forward, in particular if we don't get the kind of necessary, boost from the pandemic response. And what we've seen with COVID-19 is populists out of power seem to have lost the edge. And even some in power have been losing popularity in terms of their responses. But if the economic crisis deepens, and if there's a neoliberal focus on debt, if that returns, then the extreme right populists will be back. And of course, their positions, I mean, they're very different from country to country. Their positions vary, but generally you can see that they're against EU-wide cooperation, even if that means green, or especially perhaps if it means green cooperation. There's some climate skepticism from the Nordics, but others are green on the extreme right. Are they green only in their own backyards, i.e. Marine Le Pen? And what we also see is, and this was mentioned earlier, I think, I think that was Kenneth, but now what you see is that most of these parties are anti-neoliberal, pro-welfare state, except they're pro-welfare state for us, for nobody else, so anti-immigrant, all of this. Okay, so that's my answer to sort of the green question, but I think the main point is that even if we have a green alliance with an ambitious agenda, this isn't enough. The EU cannot go it alone, even if it's a good start. And for that, we really need to rethink capitalism within Europe and beyond. We need to avoid certainly the resilience of liberalism, neoliberalism in Europe, but also in the global economy. So the big question is, will neoliberal core ideas remain, that the market's better than the state and debt is bad? Or is there going to be a serious rethinking of economics? A kind of state market rebalancing, maybe new managed globalization. This was what Danny Roderick talks about a lot. Rethinking, what about rethinking the mandate of international institutions? All Latin American countries need is for the Washington Consensus to be reimposed after the pandemic or during the pandemic. You know, maybe what the world needs are new global pandemic funds, just like the EU Recovery Fund. I don't hear anyone talking about that. There's also a lot about, and here again, thinking about the WTO and sort of kind of globalization rules, whether informal or formal. You know, there needs to be more protection for infant industries, limit the rapidity of the flow of capital in and out of countries, allowing more reinstatement of capital controls, although we've seen a little bit of that. And then what about trade? You know, we've got to recognize that the current trade regimes creates too many losers and massive inequality vis-a-vis the winners. I think we're going to see, in any case, given the impact of the pandemic, the recognition that you can't try to, you know, that you don't have masks and you can't go to China for masks. That's the US and Europe. So there's going to have to be a repatriation of certain production activities with perhaps limits on capital mobility for developed countries. There may be some shift from service industries back to some manufacturing. Nationalizations are already beginning, partial nationalizations, as in opposition to bailouts, which is what we saw last time around. And of course, perhaps a new role for the state everywhere, which I think speaks to some of Nicolás's concerns. Guaranteeing minimum wage, a livable wage, guaranteed income, more in terms of welfare state. You know, so basically what I'm saying is there needs to be a rethinking of the international liberal order if liberalism, political and economic, is going to continue, which would mean less neoliberalism and more real liberalism. There's also got to be more social rights to attack inequality, as well as political rights and economic. And of course, here we've got to go green, very green, focus investment on renewable energy, infrastructure projects, et cetera, et cetera. But as I initially said, it can't only happen in Europe. We need international cooperation, beginning with the United States, which means without President Donald Trump, which takes us back to Kenneth's comments. Let's hope Biden wins. If not, well, we don't want to go back to religion, but, you know, praying may be necessary. Thank you.
Many thanks, Vivien. So we still have a couple of minutes left, so I will raise a couple of questions and we will follow the same order. So I will start with Ken, then I will move to Nicolás and then to Vivien. And I hope that each of you can try to answer relatively short so that we end maybe a couple of minutes later. So I will start with Ken, and I have two short questions to you. The first question is related to the social outbreak in Chile, what we call in Chile el estallido social. And Nomen Necio, he asks, to what extent do you think that the estallido social, the social outbreak, will have consequences beyond Chile? This means for other Latin American countries. So in theory, we could think that the solutions that we will find in this country might have an impact in other places of Latin America. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. The second question is related to, you probably have seen this issue that there was this letter signed by Noam Chomsky and also other intellectuals saying that there is this problem about growing intolerance within the left, so to say. And this goes back to the question of how well is the left prepared to deal with the current situation or not. Because one of the biggest troubles is that the left normally tends to have a lot of internal divisions. So I don't know, I would like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Okay, thanks for the questions from the audience. Let me start with the Chilean social protests, and I'll try to be brief. The extraordinary level of social mobilization and protests that we saw in Chile at the end of last year, moving right up into the period where the pandemic hits, and obviously the pandemic has altered the political context in Chile, but certainly the protest movement is speaking to profound needs and grievances within Chilean society, both with political institutions and the political establishment, and then certainly with the neoliberal model, and in particular what I would call the social pillars of the neoliberal model. So education, the social security system, pensions, healthcare, et cetera. And to that extent, in some ways I see the social we talk a lot in Latin America about anti-neoliberal social protests, but for the most part in other countries, what we see are protests are in a context of economic crisis where there are adjustments being imposed, some sort of structural adjustment or austerity measures. And so you get IMF food riots, or there's an effort to try in a context of financial crisis, perhaps. And so you get their anti-neoliberal protests, but I think it's a little bit different from what we're seeing in Chile. In Chile, this is not a response to a short-term economic crisis or a financial meltdown. It's not a protest in response to the imposition of neoliberal reforms. It's protest really against what Polanyi called market society. I mean, that's what Chileans are protesting against. It's a society where the market dictates all social relationships. And Chileans, in many respects, I think are out ahead in part because the Chilean model is, let's face it, Chile is, it's the showcase of neoliberalism. It was the first, it was the most comprehensive, it was the most thorough, and it was also the most successful. And in some ways, what you're seeing are Chileans pushing back against a very mature market society, even though there have been efforts on the part of the center-left governments in Chile to modify neoliberalism, especially those social pillars of the neoliberal model. So there have been efforts to modify it. Clearly, Chilean society is saying that's not enough. We want more, and we want to rethink the relationship between the political institutions and this underlying social and economic order. And so I think you could certainly, is Chile perhaps the future of other Latin American countries? Could you see some of this pushback in other places? Quite possibly so. Perhaps other countries will learn the limitations, sort of the political limitations of the neoliberal model by looking at Chile. You would hope that they would do so, but I'm not so sure. But I think in many respects, I think Chile really is kind of at a different level of advancement with their neoliberal model than other places in the region. And it's a little bit different kind of anti-neoliberal protest that you see taking place. And then just briefly on the question about the intolerance, is there a growing intolerance of the left in the United States? The letter that was signed by 150 prominent intellectuals, it's interesting. And of course, this is a debate that has gone on. Certainly, if you watch Fox News, they're constantly hammering the suppression of individual liberties on the part of the left. And so for them, it's the left, it's not the Trump administration that is a threat to democratic rights and liberties, it's the left. And so there's an old discourse about this in the United States. What's different is to see dissent emerging from within the left-wing intelligentsia raising the issues. I think it's certainly something that people should, it's good to be sensitive to these kinds of concerns. And to the extent that it's not just right-wing paranoia that's feeding it, but also a left-wing intelligentsia, it certainly drives home the point that we need to be sensitive to it. I myself have to say, I am very deeply concerned about challenges to the democratic order in the United States, and the concerns I have are not those of suppression by left-wing forces, sort of the tyranny of political correctness. I think we can be sensitive to those issues. I don't see it being a cutting-edge concern in the United States. I think we have much, much deeper and more profound challenges to the democratic institutionality in the United States than those particular concerns. And that's where my issues lie.
Excellent. Many thanks, Ken. And I will move now to Nicolás. So I have two questions for you, Nicolás. One is in English and the other one is in Spanish, but of course you can reply in Spanish. So the first question comes from Ana Richter, and she asks, how do you feel about the AFP pension system that we have in Chile? So her question is a scapegoat for general discontent, or there is actually something wrong with the pension system in an economic sense? It is a flawed system, so how so, and what would be a better system? What would you think about that? Y la segunda pregunta para Nicolás es de Eugenio Rivera, que nos dice si podrías desarrollar un poco más la relación que identificas entre la permanencia dominante de la oligarquía y los problemas del presidencialismo con una cultura política multipartidaria. Y él pregunta esto porque en teoría dice no calza tanto la idea de la oligarquía impidiendo reformas tributarias en el segundo gobierno de Bachelet, porque también sabemos de que fue torpedeada por sectores al interior de la coalición de gobierno el intento de las reformas de Michelle Bachelet.
Our low level of pensions is a problem that arises from a number of factors. One is low wages, second, high periods of unemployment, third, the fact that people is living more and more, fourth, low rate of contribution. So AFPs themselves are just a fifth part of the problem. However, in politics, symbols matter a lot. And when you have those miserable pensions and sort of a legal oligopoly, because that's what AFPs are, because, you know, contributions are mandatory. And you have to channel them to 5 EFPs that control the bulk of the money. And they make very handsome profits out of doing a very mediocre job. So in short, to change the industry is paramount, in my view, to give back some legitimacy to the system. But it's not going to end there, because you will have to make a number of other changes as well. Eso era lo primero. Lo segundo, para Eugenio, a ver, la forma en que actúa el hiperpresidencialismo y cómo eso impide una coalición de centro-izquierda es bastante sutil. Pero si tú tienes un país con una tradición bipartidaria, como por ejemplo Estados Unidos, no es del todo improbable que quien gane la presidencia gane la mayoría del Congreso. Y por tanto va a poder llevar adelante su programa. Si tú tienes hiperpresidencialismo en una sociedad multipartidaria, lo abrumadoramente más probable es que quien gane la presidencia va a tener minoría parlamentaria. A eso tú tienes que agregarle que en Chile a los parlamentarios se les elige individualmente, no por listas, como en España o parcialmente en Alemania o en tantos otros países europeos. Por tanto, tú tienes que negociar con todos y cada uno de ellos. La probabilidad en este esquema de que el gobierno pueda lograr una coalición de intereses suficientemente grande como para alterar los quórums enormes que se requieren, por ejemplo, para rehacer el Estado empresario o rehacer un sistema de seguridad social, es realmente muy baja. Y el elemento de propiedad casi privada e individual de los escaños hace una diferencia, porque en el gobierno de la presidenta, no obstante que teníamos mayoría en los congresos, tú tenías ciertos parlamentarios dentro de la coalición gobernante que no estaban de acuerdo con el programa. Y el que el partido hubiese firmado el apoyo a la presidenta no se traducía en que tuviéramos sus votos favorables. Y si a eso le agrega los quórums constitucionales, tiene el resultado que tuvimos. Por tanto, evidentemente, si tú tuvieras un sistema donde el presidente tuviese que tener la mayoría del Congreso, y eso se logra cuando la segunda vuelta se hace en el Congreso, no en la ciudadanía. Y los parlamentarios son elegidos por listas. El presidente o primer ministro, según cuál sea el sistema, tiene acuerdo con los partidos que constituyen la mayoría del Parlamento, que creo además debería haber Cámara Única. Y ahí tú puedes hacer una negociación dentro de la coalición para saber qué tan lejos vas, pero una vez que llega a un acuerdo, eso manda para cada uno de los parlamentarios y no tienes que comenzar con esta cosa que los americanos llaman el pork barrel, que es para conseguirte un voto incluso dentro de tu propia coalición, tienes que tener algo que ofrecer. Eso.
Muchas gracias. Vivien, I turn now to you and the last two questions that I have. So the first question that I have is from Eugenio also, and he asks about the subtitle of your book, because the title is Europe Crisis of Legitimacy, but you have a very nice subtitle, which is Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. So it would be nice if you can explain a bit the reason for the subtitle. And the second question that I have to you is something that you mentioned at the end, that you were telling us that maybe this is the moment in which we need to rethink capitalism. And my question is related to digital capitalism and the politics of taxation, because we know that Gaia, very big companies related to digital capitalism, think about Amazon and the whole problems that it had with European Union, but this is only one example amongst others. So do you have any ideas about how to deal with this problem? So the politics of taxation and digital capitalism.
Yes, some ideas on the second, but on the first, thanks, Eugenio, for the question. The subtitle of the book, Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone, was essentially that I see this as highly problematic in terms of legitimacy. By governing by rules and ruling by numbers, it takes us back to my early discussion of neoliberalism. And the assumption that all you need to do is follow procedures. And in this case, in the Eurozone, these procedures are rules, the Stability and Growth Pact that mandates low levels of deficit and debt. And ruling by numbers is then that the EU, because there could be no political negotiation or political government deciding how to deal with member states in whichever way, that the Eurozone member states agreed to have specific numbers in terms of monetary policy and in terms of national governments, debts, deficits, etc. So this is governing by rules and ruling by numbers, highly problematic. If you think at the national level, what government actually says we are going to have only this level of deficit and it's going to be 3%, no more or less, and that debt can't be more than 60%, and if it's higher than that, it has to keep going down to 60%. These are assumptions about how you govern an economy that, of course, as we know now, are wrong. You don't have to have 60%. You can have more debt, and with the pandemic, all of a sudden, debt is no longer an issue. How does this happen? Where has been the obsession, in particular the Eurozone, but actually of most countries. So that's essentially the sort of the origins of the title, and it's been a particular problem in Europe in the Eurozone crisis, as various countries, in particular those in trouble, ended up being forced to stick to the numbers and to try to get down to them. I mean, it means that a country such as Italy has had a primary surplus all this time because it has had high debt levels from the past, from the 1980s. So it's a 135% debt level, which if it had had its own central bank would not be a big deal. But because it no longer has its own central bank and the EU rules are debt is bad, anything above 60%, it's problematic for Italy. And because the discourse in Europe is that debt is bad, the markets then punish countries that have high debt for no necessarily good reason. So that's the one. And now on the digital capitalism and taxation, this of course is a really serious problem, not just for Europe, but for the rest of the world. And it takes us back to issues of funding the welfare state as well. Because the problem is that, you know, I'm sure you've read about, I can't remember if it's the double Dutch or the Irish sandwich or vice versa, but Google, Apple, all of these digital platforms essentially game the taxation system in Europe in a way that means that they pay almost no taxes anywhere. And then they get special deals on top of it. So that is highly problematic. It's also, you know, beyond just the digital platforms, we can talk about Netherlands and Ireland having very low taxes, corporate incorporation taxes, so that most of the companies, most major companies actually have their headquarters in the Netherlands or Ireland, so that a country like Portugal in the midst of the crisis asked the Commission, could it lower its level of corporate taxes so that the major Portuguese companies that had gone to incorporate in the Netherlands would come back. They were told, no, you're not allowed to do that. But so this is a more general problem about taxation, but the problem is, and you know, it's about offshore accounts and all, we know about Panama Papers as well. So it's not just digital platforms, although that of course is a big problem. But why is this relevant to the welfare state? Because if this revenue from, if digital platforms and if big corporations more generally had to pay regular rates of taxation, then it's very likely that welfare states would not find themselves in such deep problems, and that you would no longer have the argument, oh, we have to keep tightening our belts, we have to keep cutting welfare, we have to cut pensions because we don't have enough money. Well, there is a lot of money out there, but that money goes from the treasuries, if you will, of the accounts books of digital companies and major corporations straight into the capital markets, into the financial markets, and helps, you know, and goes to the wealthy, helping to increase the major inequalities that we see across, you know, across not just developed countries, but also developing countries. So this is about rebalancing things. But how do you do that? You know, unless you actually have some form of global governance or global agreements. It doesn't even have to be about global governance. It has to be global agreements on issues. And, you know, there was a window when Obama was president, but it didn't happen. And with Trump, it's not happening. So, you know, maybe if Biden were elected, just maybe we would get somewhere. But in my sense is that if the US and Europe were to get together, we'd get somewhere. Big question.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vivien. So we are running out of time now. Nicolás, you want to say something short or? Yes.
Extremely short. I cannot agree more with Vivien. What the pandemic is showing us is that at the end of the day, we, humanity, are heard. So if someone is left behind, it will catch all us. So global government for fair and enough taxation is the backbone of a new system. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nicolás. Thank you very much, Kenneth. Thank you very much, Vivien. And also a very, very big thank you to Jorge and Margit, who has been doing the simultaneous translation. This is a hard job. And also thank you very much for everybody who was following us via Facebook and also who has seen this live also via Zoom. Muchas gracias y nos vemos entonces.